Thaddeus Hale tightened his jaw and stepped into the grey dawn. The weight of a past he had learned to carry like a stubborn wound that never fully heals. The air tasted of damp earth and smoke, of corn husks and old fear. He walked the road between a swath of pines and a field where the last harvest lay dry and pale as bones. His fingers brushed the coarse cloth of a sack slung over his shoulder, where a few keepsakes lay, one cracked photograph, one faded letter, a shard of a promise spoken by a man who was once his master, and later the distance between years. He had crossed the river of memory, he thought, and found himself on the muddy bank of a river's truth. The sun labored up over the ridge, tone-warm and grit-brown, as if the day itself would spit out the quiet of the past if he pressed hard enough. He was an ex-slave, freed by an ember-lit promise of emancipation, and by work that wore his hands down to the marrow. The years since had not erased the ache of a name given to him in fear and in mercy, the name of a father who did not hold him as a boy forever, but who did not stay to see him become a man either. The memory of his son, his firstborn, sold away into a life he could barely imagine, haunted him even as he walked out into this new life carved from the same land that had once claimed him. As he moved, the world around him sharpened into edges, the creak of a wagon wheel, the soft thud of a mule's hoof on the dirt, the distant clack of a blacksmith's hammer. The smell of green sap and smoke clung to his coat, a mingling of wood and heat that clung to a man who had learned to listen to the land the way a man listens to a heartbeat. It was a day with a face, and the face wore the color of fear and zeal in the same breath. The road curved toward a cluster of roughly built shacks and tents, a small encampment pinned to the riverbank by the Confederacy's forced pace and stubborn pride. Men moved with a military tremor in their shoulders, as if listening to the iron clockwork of a war that never quite told time the same way twice. Thaddeus did not blend in. His skin carried the long memory of a life that had been not a century, but a season long enough to harden his resolve and soften his gentleness in ways he'd learned to hide. He did not know the exact name of every soldier he passed, but there were faces that haunted him with a familiar gravity. The heavy-set jaw of a boy who had learned to stand tall in a world that had never granted him a place to stand at all. And he did know a cut of uniform, the grey that had the river's own disguise in it, the way a flag's thread could knot a man's fate into something heavier than sin or prayer. "Excuse me, sir?" A voice spoke, rough with tea stain and luck. "You're looking for someone?" "Perhaps," Thaddeus said, not looking up at the speaker, but listening to the voice as one listens to a locked door being turned in a room they know they'll have to enter. He turned his eyes toward the river where the mist gathered, smelling the wet reeds and iron in the air. The man stepped closer, eyes wary and curious. "If you're looking for whispers of a Hale, you'll hear 'em here. Folks say there's a Hale boy wearing grey. Call him Jonah, or that's what they call him when he's not listening to God or the devil." Thaddeus did not react at once. He let the name hang in the space between them, tasted it on his tongue as if it were a bitter fruit he had once hoped to forget. Then he spoke softer, almost without anger. "He's a son," he said. "Jonah Hale. He wears the grey and calls it duty. If you've seen him, you've seen what the war did to a boy who grew too close to the sound of a gun." The other man nodded, a shadow of fear in his eye, and stepped back as if the ground itself might swallow him for saying the wrong syllable aloud. The camp wall shifted with the wind, and the river hissed along its bend like a creature listening for a cry. By noon the camp lay under a pale sun that made every rough edge gleam. Thaddeus moved through the rows of tents, comfortable in none of them. Each step measured, every breath an act of survival. He passed a table where a pot steamed with coffee so strong it could wake the dead, and in that steam he smelled something else, an old, familiar scent that pulled at him like the memory of a father's hand on a son's shoulder. Long since gone cold, a woman with hard lines in her face and a shawl around her shoulders spoke from the doorway of a lean-to. "You looking for your boy?" she asked, her voice carrying both caution and a voice that had learned to barter for mercy in the night. "I'm looking for truth," Thaddeus answered, not meeting her eyes. He watched her hands, long, scarred, wood-brown, and saw in them an echo of his own. "Truth has many faces here, ma'am. I want what's left of mine." Her eyes flicked toward the river, toward the grey line of soldiers across the water. "If you're a man who seeks him, you'll find more than you bargained for. They say he's a good soldier, but the war has made good soldiers of bad men and bad soldiers of good men. It's a hard math." He inclined his head. "I've learned to do the math," he said, and left it at that. That night the air shifted as if the world itself had held its breath. Thaddeus found his way to the riverbank, where the water whispered in a language older than the battlefield, and the trees bent as if listening to the hush of the distant rockets. The river carried the scent of fish and mud, and somewhere far off a campfire burned with a dry, sweet burn that smelled of hope and hunger at the same time. Beyond the campfire's light, a voice rose, a young man's voice crisp with discipline, yet threaded with something that sounded like a question asked in the middle of a prayer. "Sir, we march at dawn. The river camp should be empty by then. If you want to pass, you pass before the sun breaks the hampered day." A voice answered from the shadow, not loud but clear, with a pain that could not be disguised by bravado. "No gate to pass, no door to open. There's a man here who's older than the war and sooner older than freedom. If he wants to walk in, he walks in, or we tell him to leave." The young man stepped forward into the firelight, a soldier with a hard jaw and eyes too old for his face. Across his skin a line of ink seemed to run like a river's birthmark. And when he smiled, it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Who are you?" the soldier asked, the guard's tone bending toward command. Thaddeus stepped closer, the ground seeming to hold its breath again. "I came for a name I used to carry," he said. "I came for a boy who carried a name that was never his alone. If you know him, you know what you're looking at." The soldier's glance sharpened. "Jonah Hale," he said, voice steady, as if naming a thing he could now admit. "Private Jonah Hale, Company D, Confederate Army." There it was, the moment iron-cold and inevitable. Their father and son on opposite shores of a war that had torn them apart before they knew each other's faces. "Jonah," Thaddeus whispered the name, as if it were a prayer he had not spoken in years, as if the word itself could pull a thread through time and bind them back together. The word seemed to knock the earth from beneath them, for in that moment the sun stepped from the shadow into the pale glow of the campfire. A man grown with a soldier's pride and a boy's memory clinging to the edge of his thoughts. "Father," the boy said, his voice a mixture of awe and hesitation, as if he'd seen a ghost that wore his mother's face. The sound of that single syllable, the first time he had spoken it to the man who had once been nothing more than a memory, was sharp and clear, a blade's note in the night air. Thaddeus did not move for a long breath. He studied the boy for a long moment, the way the jaw had hardened, the way a sickly lantern light had burned into his eyes, the way the uniform had etched lines into his skin that time would not easily erase. He heard the boy's breath, a rough heave that betrayed fatigue and fear, and a stubborn insistence that he stood for something larger than himself. Jonah spoke again, and his tone carried a soldier's formality, even as his eyes searched his father's face, as if trying to memorize it for a map. "You left me with nothing but a rumor and a rumor's footstep," he said, the words coming like a threat but without malice, more like a confession pushed from a body into the world. "You said you'd come for me. I waited for the day you'd show your face." Thaddeus's chest rose in a hard, slow inhalation. The memory came back to him, the day decades ago when a master had torn away from him the child who was his only kin, the boy who would grow to be a man with his own guns and battles to fight. The smell of fear and iron filled his mouth as he spoke, with care to keep his voice from breaking. "I am here," he said simply. "I am here because I am your father, because there's a wound between us that you and I must name. But I am not here to argue about names or loyalties, or the war you chose. I am here to see you, to tell you what I could not tell you across a lifetime of silence." Jonah drew a quick breath, as if the word father tasted like something he had always wanted and never believed he would have. He looked at the man who stood before him, a freed man in rags that bore the marks of years of work, now stepping into a camp where the war's fires burned at his feet and his own son's blade lay on his belt like a promise. "Then tell me what you came to tell," Jonah said, his voice lowering, the discipline of a soldier dropping away enough to reveal the raw tremor of a boy's tremor. "Tell me," Thaddeus replied, "not what the war has made of you, not what you think I deserve to hear, but what happened to you when I was not there to hold your hand through the days you learned to hate Mem, for leaving. Tell me the truth of your days." The two stood in the firelight, a pair of silhouettes bound by a single, devastating lineage, the body that housed a history neither of them could escape, and the heart that stubbornly refused to forget, even when the world told them to forget. The conversation turned, as conversations do on the threshold of memory and pain. They spoke little in the beginning, measuring the air between them as if it were a blade they both might have to cross. The boundaries of the camp, rifle straps, the scent of smoke, the rhythm of marching feet in the distance made every word count. The men around them moved with quiet caution, aware that the air held something dangerous, a reunion that could fracture the night's shell of quiet, a reunion that could either mend or rend a life. "You want to know what happened?" Jonah asked at last, his voice rough with fatigue. "Or like a river, carried us to places we didn't choose. I was sold into a life I did not choose either. I was trained to believe the flag above us is a banner for something good. And I learned to fight for it, because not fighting would have meant I died first inside." Thaddeus listened, eyes tracing the scarred field beyond the camp's line, where a distant flare of artillery could be seen, if one looked hard enough. The memory of his own days, those early naive hopes that emancipation would bring peace, the days when he had believed that liberty would mean love, not only survival, pushed at him like a rough tide. "Our lives split," he finally said, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. "Yours toward the fire, mine toward a wind that carried no mercy for the children we hoped would outlive us." He paused, the silence heavy with unsaid truths. "I didn't sell you away, not in the way a master sells his property, but I was forced to do something that I am not proud of. I did what I could to keep you alive. And what did you owe me?" Jonah flinched at the accusation, as if a summons had been laid upon him to reveal a debt that could never be paid. Yet the honesty in his eyes, tired, young, resolute, gave him a gravity beyond his years. "A father who leaves is a ghost," he said softly. "A father who returns is a miracle you don't deserve. But I fought for what I believed this morning when I should have slept the night away in a barracks of fear. I fought for something I still believe in, even if it costs me everything." Their exchange felt like a fuse burning toward a surface of ice. The night's quiet, bird calls, distant drums in the hollow. The whisper of a breeze through the pines grew louder as though the universe itself knew something must break. The following hours saw Thaddeus moving through a series of moments with Jonah that stretched like long, taut strings, each moment testing their bond in the most painful ways. There were small, sharp dialogues, penned bursts of truth and memory that punctured the night. "Do you remember your mother's name?" Thaddeus asked at one point, voice barely above a whisper. "Mary," Jonah answered, the word a tremor in the dark. "Mary Hale. We spoke of her in letters the master burned or never let us write. Her name was the echo of a home you and I never got to know. I remember a woman who kept bread scarce and hope bright as a lamp," Thaddeus said, a half smile crossing his lips that did not reach his eyes. "She taught you to dream of a day when the fields would belong to you too, not to the plough and the master's fence." Jonah's jaw trembled. "The day never came," he said, almost as if admitting a crime. "We learned to fight for a future we could not touch." The two found themselves at the river's edge again, where the water moved with a patient, inevitable current. The smell of fish and mud rose up between them, and the world seemed to shrink to the distance between two chests that rose and fell in unison with the same slow tempo of fear and resolve. Then a figure appeared on the far bank, a guard of some sort, tall, pale, with a rifle that gleamed in the pale dawn light. He called out a warning to Thaddeus to stay away from the line, to keep to his own side. The voice carried with it a hardness that suggested consequences if the warning went unheeded. Thaddeus nodded and stepped back, not for fear of a beating or a court-martial, but because there are moments when a man must choose what he will allow to happen in his presence. "Do you ever wonder why we both ended here?" Thaddeus asked quietly, not to accuse or to force a confession, but to search for a thread that might bind them beyond the war's terrible grammar. "All the time," Jonah admitted, "but I learned to swear to it, even when the oath burned my lips. I fight for something I believe in, even if I become nothing more than a ghost in a grey uniform." The father's reply came as a breath, ragged and uncertain. "I learned to fight for a son who would never forget me, even if he could not forgive me." Their words hung in the air, a fragile covenant made of pain and stubborn hope, a promise to walk through the fire and see what remained when the smoke cleared. The night stretched on. The camp settled into a rhythm of murmured prayers, and the occasional order barked into the dark. The men each carried their own burdens under their breath, and Thaddeus could hear the soft rasp of a soldier's strap on leather, the sigh of a tent that needed to breathe. The world looked as if it had decided to hold its breath until dawn, as if dawn itself might decide to reveal a way out of the war's endless hall of mirrors. In the early hours, a sudden movement shattered the quiet. Storm of steps, the crack of a branch, a shouted command. Jonah's unit prepared for a dawn march into a no-man's land of iron and fire. The night's closeness dissolved like smoke, revealing the field where lives would be, weighed by the cold ledger of the war. The exchange of words grew sharper as the moment approached its own edge, the brink of violence that would bind them forever to a truth neither of them could escape. The two men, one a father seeking the memory of a son he could not forget, the other a son who believed in a cause he was being asked to die for, stood on the riverbank, listening to the world begin to move toward a break in the day. Then, in a sudden, cruel moment, Jonah stepped forward with a soldier's training and a boy's stubborn insistence. "Wait," he said, voice low, the word almost a plea. "Don't say a word you'll regret later." Thaddeus did not respond with anger or fear, only with a pause that spoke of a life spent learning the distance between action and consequence. The moment grew thick with the scent of pine, smoke, and sweat, and the river's whisper rose up again as if it had something to tell them, something about a life that would forever bend toward mercy because it had no other choice. "Jonah," Thaddeus spoke, his voice steady but not immune to the tremor of emotion. "If you strike, strike hard. If you spare, spare with mercy. But please spare what we cannot replace, each other's memory." Jonah's eyes flickered with something sudden, a flash of fear and a flash of something else. A father he had not known but desired to know, a son who had become a man through the long, brutal schooling of war. "Father," Jonah whispered almost to himself, as if that single syllable could call the past back to life in a way nothing else could. He lifted his rifle not to threaten, but to lure a moment of truth from the river, from the night, from the country that had made them enemies, and then forced them to acknowledge that, at the heart of all the fighting, there existed only one thing that could suddenly make sense: a family. The moment broke with a suddenness that startled even the water. Jonah lunged, perhaps intending to strike, perhaps to pull his father into his own sense of duty and away from the memory that would not die. Thaddeus moved to block, his own years of labor and fear guiding the motion, and in that instant their weapons collided, not with the intent to kill, but with the intent to survive enough to learn something else, some mercy that might heal the deep wound between them. The fight was a rough, desperate thing, a struggle not simply of arms, but of history and memory pressed into a single violent moment. Thaddeus found himself grappling with his son's strength, the boy who still wore the boy's fear and longing behind the soldier's eyes. The air filled with the iron tang of cold steel, the rough rasp of cloth ripped by motion, the wet sting of sweat and the smell of fear and rain on dust. "Stop, Jonah," Thaddeus commanded, but his voice carried no weight against the boy who moved with the stubborn rhythm of a person who believed his life could still mean something beyond the war's claims on him. The conflict escalated until Thaddeus's hands, rough with a lifetime of hard labor and softer for a moment in a child's memory, found a way to gain control of the blade. The moment when mercy became the only path open to him came suddenly, and with all the quiet force of a mountain's breath. Jonah, in a rush of anger and grief, misread a moment and pressed on, his blade aimed at his father's chest. Thaddeus, caught in the force of the attack, reacted not from anger, but from a memory of all the ways a father might fail his son, and all the ways a son might fail to forgive. In the clash of metal and bone and fear, a terrible calculus formed, the kind that makes a human heart beat in a way that feels as if it's trying to squeeze. The last thing left of a life into a single decision. The decision came not with a shout but with a breath, a single exhale that seemed to loosen the world's hold on them both. Thaddeus had to choose mercy in a way that would cruelly seem his own life, back to this boy's future, to bind them with a thread so fragile it might snap at a moment's breath. He did not think of the history, the politics, the wars that had torn them apart. He thought of a mother who had loved them both in a world that would not have accepted either of them, of a home that lay far beyond the river and the fields. With a quiet that was almost reverent, father and son faced one another, weapons resting in their hands but no longer aimed with intent to kill. The moment swelled with a terrible power, and Thaddeus spoke, his voice a rough whisper that cut through the clamor of metal and the distant commands from the camp. "Jonah," he breathed, "you do not have to live with this, not like I have lived with mine. Step back. Walk away from the line you've drawn with your future." The boy paused, the blade halting its arc, his breath ragged as if his body remembered an assault long ago. His eyes searched his father's face, searching for a reason to trust the mercy that the father offered now. A mercy that came at the cost of blood and fear, and the possibility that they would never stand as father and son again. "Mercy is what keeps us human," Thaddeus said. More to himself than to the boy, but he spoke loud enough for Jonah to hear. Mercy for those who cannot forgive themselves. Mercy for those who fought when they had no choice. Mercy for a future that might still be possible if we let the past be what it is, and not what it could have been. In that breath, the river's murmur softened to a sigh. The men around them did not move, their attention caught by the moment's risk, the thin thread of possibility that one wrong move might snap. Jonah's hand trembled, the blade quivering in the air as if a small animal might spring from it at any second. The boy's eyes found his father's, and in that gaze there was a sorrow older than the war. The memory of a home burned in their shared past, the knowledge that they could never again return to what they had known before. Finally, with a sound that was almost a sob, Jonah dropped the weapon and stepped backward, his chest heaving with the effort of controlling his own will. He did not run. He did not plead. He stood there at the edge of a line now drawn not on the river's sand, but inside both their chests, and waited for the mercy he could not demand but could only receive, if mercy would come at the cost of his own life. In that instant a decision was made, not by either man's mind, but by the bore of the life they had lived, the life that a slave's son could be soldiers in a war that did not want them to exist, the life that demanded blood if mercy would ever arrive again. Thaddeus's eyes closed for a moment. Then he opened them with a heavy sense of the truth he had carried for years. The war might demand more than one broken heart, but mercy could still be the one thing that saved a man's soul from becoming a memory's echo. "Jonah," he said, his voice a low, steady bell, "I am your father. I am not your enemy. If you will accept mercy, I will bear it with you as best I can. If you will not, I will do what mercy demands of any man when the other has shown only hatred and fear." Jonah's breath hitched, his lips trembling as if he wanted to spit out a mouthful of anger and fear and apology at the same time. He whispered the words that could not undo the past, but could at least seal the moment with a vow. "Then end this, Father. If mercy must have blood, let it be my own." The world seemed to hold its breath again. The river listening, the pines listening, the camp listening to a sound no living thing should ever have to hear, the soft, inexorable closing of a life that was always two lives bound by a single thread of blood and memory. Thaddeus moved with a grim grace, a man who had learned to do what he had to do to protect the fragile thing he could still call family. In the stillness after, the boy lay upon the riverbank, his breath a slow, goading wind that teased the edge of life. Thaddeus stood over him, the world shrinking away to this narrow moment. A man who had done the unthinkable for the sake of mercy, and a son who would never be the same again because of the war's insistence on redrawing the lines of love. "Close your eyes," Thaddeus whispered, the command soft, almost a prayer. He did not want the boy to remember the last face he had seen in life as a face of fear or anger or pain, but as something more human, perhaps as the father who had once given him life and who now gave him this last mercy to spare him from the war's unyielding cruelty. Jonah's eyes fluttered once, then stilled, his chest no longer lifting with life. The river kept its own patient vigil, a witness to the moment when mercy decided the fate of two generations, one born of a bond formed in slavery and the other forged in the crucible of civil war. The camp's edges blurred around them, as if the night itself was unwilling to witness what it had always known would come. Thaddeus did not weep immediately. The mercy he had offered required him to stand with the weight of the world upon his shoulders and look outward toward a future he could not touch. But soon the tremor in his hands came, and his breath came in a ragged, defeated rhythm. He reached for the boy's shoulder, feeling the chill of death in the palm of his own hand, the hand that once held his son's as a child, but now held a grave's quiet once more. The dawn crept closer, pale and patient, and with it moved the first soldiers, drawing lines of discipline and purpose once more across the river's face. Thaddeus did not stay to witness the next march or the next order. He stepped away from the body, away from the last living tie that could have bound him to the boy who had once called him father, and walked into the soft, morning mist that rose like a whisper from the ground. He carried the weight of a life ending not with rage or revenge, but with a mercy that could have no other fulfillment. The river's edge bore the marks of what had happened. 2 footprints, one a stubborn imprint in mud, where a man had stood and faced his past. Another that followed, lighter, as if the river itself had carried away the last trace of a boy who would never know the father who stood before him, as if the world might still be rearranged to fit their longing. Thaddeus did not look back. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had learned that mercy is not something you hold, but something you risk releasing into the world, even when doing so costs you something you cannot bear to lose. The morning grew brighter, the air filled with the breath of men waking to a day that would not end the war, but would at least offer a mournful reprieve to 2 hearts bound by a history they could not escape. In the days that followed, the camp prepared for movement, and the river's voice grew louder with the water's churn. Thaddeus did not go looking for the boy's friends or the men who might ask him about what had occurred on the river's edge. He moved with the measured steps of a man who had learned to walk through a life where each step might be his last, where every breath was a question to be answered only by the mercy a man could give when there was no other choice. What remained of the memory of the boy, of the son who wore grey and bore a father's history in his bones, was now a legend whispered by the wind along the river. A story that would travel across generations as a cautionary tale about the perils of a war that could tear a family apart so completely that even mercy could not undo what was broken. Thaddeus walked toward the future, with a silence that was heavy with the weight of a truth neither time nor distance could erase. He had found his son again, in a world torn asunder, and the mercy he offered had come at the cost of a life he could never replace. The river's morning carried a quiet mercy of its own, the soft sounds of the water washing away the traces of the night, the delicate scent of damp soil and new light, the feeling of air brushing over skin like a soft, pale kiss. Thaddeus walked forward with the dawn, a man who had learned that love can survive even in the teeth of a war that would insist it could not, and that mercy can be the last painful gift a father can give to a son who chose a fate that required him to be his own worst enemy. And so the memory of a reunion cut through the war's long story like a single, stubborn thread. A man, once a slave and his son once a child, bound together by a choice made under fire and saved by mercy. The world would keep fighting, the river would keep moving, and the two, one who lived, one who died in the name of loyalty twisted by hatred, would remain etched in the land's memory as a reminder that war does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with mercy, or it ends with the silence of life that never again breathes in the same way. The ex-slave stopped at the river's edge once more, the air cool and the light clean on his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, tasting again the night's bitter mercy and the truth of what had happened. When he opened them, he found the world moving forward with the quiet insistence of time itself, bearing him and the memory of his son toward whatever dawn might bring. He carried within him the weight of a mercy that could only exist because of the grave that now claimed the boy's life, the memory of the moment when a father chose to save a son by letting him go, and in letting go chose to keep the living part of his heart from dying too. He walked away not as the man who had to forgive the world, but as the man who had learned to forgive himself for what the war had forced him to do. The price of mercy had been high, and the cost of memory would stay with him until the day he died. Yet in the quiet of the river and the breath of morning that followed, there was a stubborn light, a stubborn light, that promised him a future in which love and memory might still endure. And in that endurance perhaps a measure of peace would be found, and so the day began anew. The river sang its low tune, and Thaddeus Hale, ex-slave, father, man who had faced the deepest fear a person can bear, found himself still walking, step by careful step, toward a horizon that might someday forgive the past. If only mercy could be allowed to stand long enough for it to take root in the world. He did not turn back to the night, for the night had already given him his answer. Mercy, costly as life, remains the only thing that can truly bind a father to a son when war has severed every other known connection. The memory of a child who became a soldier would endure, carried forward by the land that birthed them both, a land that learned through their tragedy to remember the single, enduring